From a man cursing the juries.
Yeah, I'll see you all in hell, too. You remember that. Every one of you, I'll see you in hell.
To a former chapter president giving a jailhouse interview the day after his sentencing to insist he was the real victim.
These law enforcement officers are just flat out obsessed with trying to put me and other Hells Angels in jail.
These are the most dangerous bikers in the world, reacting to their sentences. Joseph Lancia.
A 5-year full sentence, all of which is to be served at the ACI.
That is Rhode Island Hells Angels President Joseph Lancia. And what you just watched is the moment a Providence Superior Court judge sentenced him to 15 years in prison with 5 to serve. As the handcuffs went on his wrists, he looked over at the dozen full-patch members sitting in the courtroom in their colors, nodded, and gave them a smile. When the judge asked if he had anything to say before sentencing, he said no. The events that brought him to that courtroom started on June 12, 2019. Richard Starnino, 47 years old and a former club prospect, was driving past the Hells Angels clubhouse in Providence when Lancia stepped outside, pulled a semi-automatic weapon from his pocket, and fired one shot at the vehicle as it passed. Then he walked back inside. What Lancia did not account for was the clubhouse's own security camera, which had captured the entire thing. After the shooting, another Hells Angels member removed the digital video recorder from the building. State police recovered it. That footage became the central evidence against him. While out on bail in February 2020, Lancia punched a man unconscious outside the Cadillac Lounge strip club in Providence and was taken into custody at the scene. He pleaded no contest. The more serious charges, including assault with intent to commit murder, were dismissed as part of the deal. 15 years with 5 to serve, $3,650 in restitution, a nod to his brothers, a smile, and nothing else to say. Jay Witt. On the morning of July 14th, 2013, William Furlong, 48 years old, was found dead between a couch and a bar inside the Hells Angels clubhouse at 27th and J Streets in Omaha, Nebraska. Surveillance footage documented Witt's movements through the night and into the early hours, and a woman who had been present at the clubhouse told police that Witt had killed Furlong during an argument. When investigators pressed for a motive, the answer that came back from the evidence was as simple as it was senseless. Jay Witt just did not like him. If Witt had been convicted of second-degree murder, he would have faced a significantly longer sentence than what he ultimately received. But he entered a no-contest plea to manslaughter, and the murder charge was dropped by the Douglas County Attorney's Office. And therefore, when he stood in front of a judge in October 2014, he nodded at his fellow gang members who were present at sentencing. The sentence he received was 22.5 years. He was 48 years old when he entered the Nebraska State Penitentiary that October. He would never leave it. In September 2019, the Nebraska Department of Correctional Services announced that Jay Witt had died at the penitentiary on a Wednesday evening while being treated for an undisclosed medical condition. He was 53 years old. He had served 5 years of his sentence. A grand jury conducted an investigation into his death as required by Nebraska state law, but no cause was publicly determined. The man who had killed a fellow Hells Angels member inside the organization's own clubhouse for no documented reason beyond personal dislike died in a state prison before he had served even a fraction of what the court had given him. Stephen Sanders.
This former San Diego leader of the notorious biker gang, the Hells Angels, says he will spend the next 25 years in prison for crimes he didn't commit.
Stephen Sanders was 44 years old and the president of the San Diego Hells Angels chapter when he sat down with a local news reporter the day after his sentencing in September 2013 and told them he was not guilty of anything he had been convicted of. The interview he gave that day is one of the most revealing moments in this entire video because it shows exactly how a man who had pleaded guilty to kidnapping, robbery, solicitation to commit murder and assault with a gang enhancement presents himself to the outside world when the cameras are rolling.
I'm in here for multiple cases. I'm in here for armed robbery with a gang enhancement. I'm in here for assaults. I'm in here for now there's so many cases.
The crimes Sanders was referencing dated back to April 2007 when he ordered a violent attack on Nick Neff, a former member who had been expelled from the club. Neff was beaten, tied up, and forced to have his Hells Angels tattoos removed from his body. Sanders warned him directly that if he went to the police, he would be killed, and forced him to sign over the title to his motorcycle. 3 years later, in May 2010, Sanders orchestrated a second attack. Preston James was ambushed at a motorcycle shop owned by Sanders' wife, beaten with a baseball bat by Sanders, his son Shane, and other members, and then kidnapped. James's motorcycle was eventually traced all the way to Hawaii. While in custody, Sanders attempted to arrange hits on witnesses, victims, a police officer, and 2 of the prosecutors handling his case. Recordings captured him proposing specific methods and weapons to what he believed was a willing accomplice. That accomplice was an informant.
They try to label us a gang. We deny that. We're incorporated as a corporation. We pay federal and state taxes in the United States, and we adamantly deny that we're a gang.
Sanders told the reporter that his problems began in 2006 when he claimed law enforcement began targeting him and his family. He alleged that DEA agents altered evidence, raided his family home and businesses in San Diego over a 4-year period, and that a fellow inmate and convicted murderer turned informant had secretly recorded their conversations and manipulated the audio to produce the result the prosecution needed.
The audio recordings were damaging to me, to my defense, and once they were manipulated and they had the conversations the way they wanted them, that's what ultimately convicted me. These law enforcement officers are just flat out obsessed with trying to put me and other Hells Angels in jail.
The day before his sentencing, his attorney filed a motion to withdraw the guilty plea, citing a new witness who the defense claimed could change the outcome. Judge O'Neill reviewed the claim, ruled the witness lacked credibility, and denied the motion. Sanders then stood in court and told the judge he had felt pressured into the plea because he feared a longer sentence at trial. Despite his on-record admission, he insisted he never recognized the Hells Angels as a criminal street gang. 25 years in state prison. He had waived his right to appeal as part of the deal, and there was nowhere left to go. Marius Lazar. Marius Lazar was 51 years old and a founding member of the Romanian chapter of the Hells Angels when a federal jury in Beaumont, Texas, convicted him on November 17, 2023, of conspiracy to commit racketeering, conspiracy to import cocaine, and conspiracy to commit money laundering. If the location sounds unusual for a Romanian national to be standing trial, the path that brought him there is the reason why. Through a connection with a fellow Hells Angels member from New Zealand, Lazar had joined a conspiracy to purchase more than 400 kilograms of from a source in the United States who he believed was a powerful trafficker operating at the highest level of the American narcotics market. But the person he was negotiating with was not a trafficker. He was an undercover agent of the Enforcement Administration, and every conversation, every proposal, and every commitment Lazar made was being recorded and documented in real time. What made the case significantly more serious than a straightforward trafficking conspiracy was what Lazar added to the negotiations on top of the purchase. He solicited the undercover agent to kill 2 members of a rival motorcycle club in Romania and offered to supply the agent with rifles, grenades, armored vehicles, and other military-grade equipment that he understood would be used against police officers in the United States. He was not simply trying to move cocaine across borders. He was attempting to arm someone he believed would deploy that arsenal against American law enforcement on his behalf. The conspiracy involved nearly $1 million transferred through bank wires and Bitcoin. Romanian and American law enforcement worked together to secure Lazar's arrest in Bucharest, and he was extradited to stand trial in Texas. 2 of his co-defendants, a pair of New Zealanders named Murray Michael Matthews and Mark Patrick Johnson, remain fugitives as of the most recent reporting. On January 15, 2025, United States District Judge Marcia A. Crone sentenced Lazar to 300 months in federal prison. That is 25 years. Some outlets reported the figure as 300 years, which is incorrect. The correct number is 300 months. The founding member of the Romanian Hells Angels chapter will be in his mid-70s before he is eligible for release. Ali Ipekci. On the evening of May 20th, 2011, the Outlaws Motorcycle Club in the Belgian town of Maasmechelen were holding an opening reception for a new tire center in an industrial zone on Industriellen. The owner of the tire center had connections to the Hells Angels, which meant that the gathering of Outlaws members and associates at his business that evening was already a powder keg of territorial tension before anyone arrived. But nobody at that reception could have anticipated how the night would end. Outlaws member Freddie Putt, 52 years old, hang-around Jeff Bankin, 58 years old, and supporter Michael Garrikins, 28 years old, were shot dead at the reception. Their bodies were then loaded into Freddie Putt's own vehicle, which was driven to the canal at IJsden-Dorp and pushed into the water. The entire operation from arrival to departure took 6 minutes. That 6-minute window would become the detail that undid Ali Ipekci. The jury at the Tongres Assize Court noted specifically the gap between the moment a white Citroën Berlingo arrived at the tire center and the moment Ipekci drove away in that same vehicle. 6 minutes. 3 men dead, bodies in a canal, and an alibi that collapsed under scrutiny when the wife of the tire center owner claimed Ipekci had been at her home for a barbecue at the time of the killings. The jury did not find that account credible. 2 other suspects were initially identified. A co-defendant named Eddie C. died in prison in 2012 before the trial concluded. A third suspect, Giovanni M., was cleared by an Antwerp court. That left Ipekci alone to face the verdict. The jury of the Tongres Assize Court found him guilty of triple murder, and he was sentenced to 30 years in prison. Ali was greeting his lawyer and pointing towards unidentified Persian in court after the verdict. Raymond Folks. Raymond Folks, known to the club as Ray Ray, was the former president of the Sonoma County Hells Angels chapter. In May 2023, a federal jury convicted him of assault with a firearm in aid of racketeering, RICO conspiracy, and witness intimidation following a 2-month trial before U.S. District Judge Edward Chen in San Francisco. The charges against him were part of a broader federal grand jury indictment issued in October 2017 against 11 members and associates of the Sonoma County chapter, covering a broad pattern of criminal activity, including murder, drug distribution, assault, robbery, extortion, and witness intimidation.
The former president of the Hells Angels Sonoma chapter, Raymond Ray Ray Folks, is charged with conspiracy, assault, and witness intimidation.
The specific offense that produced Folks' conviction began as a personal grievance. A member of the Sonoma County chapter had been expelled after an affair with Folks' common-law wife. The expulsion itself was not unusual by the standards of the 1% world. But what Folks did during the expulsion was. He organized a multi-hour beating of the expelled member at the Sonoma County clubhouse, during which he beat the man with a baseball bat and forcibly tattooed his forehead. He induced co-defendant Jonathan Nelson to pistol whip the victim's face while the assault was still ongoing. And while the former member was still being held and beaten, Folks sexually assaulted the victim's wife and threatened her to comply with his demands and not contact authorities. He was convicted of witness intimidation specifically for that assault and that threat. U.S. Attorney Ismail Ramsey described the pattern of conduct that produced both the Folks and Ranieri convictions in terms that required no elaboration. Folks and Ranieri, he said, followed a malicious code of conduct that permitted and sometimes encouraged the beating, maiming, and even killing of anyone who dared to cross their criminal enterprise. As of April 2026, Folks remains jailed and has still not been sentenced, despite being convicted nearly 3 years ago. The reason is that prosecutors have disclosed documents to the defense that had not been provided before or during the trial. Those disclosures have triggered a challenge to the convictions of all 5 defendants in the broader Sonoma County and Salem RICO case. An evidentiary hearing is expected at which FBI agents and at least one confidential federal informant will testify under oath. The outcome of that hearing could determine whether Folks faces sentencing or whether the case that has kept him in federal custody for nearly 3 years has to begin again. Jonathan Nelson, Brian Wayne Wendt, and Russell Taylor Ott Sonoma County Hells Angels.
And this was part of a 3-year investigation involving federal, state, and local agencies. Among the people arrested, alleged associates of the Hells Angels, Sonoma County.
In the week of June 14th to 17th, 2024, 3 men received mandatory life sentences in a San Francisco federal courtroom for the murder of Joel Silva, a former Sonoma County Hells Angels member. Jonathan Nelson, known as John, was 46 years old and the chapter president. Brian Wayne Went was 45 years old and the president of the Fresno chapter. Russell Taylor Ott, known as Rusty, was 70 years old at sentencing and had been trusted by Silva's family for years. That trust was what made him useful to the plan. In 2014, Silva attended a motorcycle event in Laconia, New Hampshire, where he threatened a member of the Salem, Massachusetts chapter. Nelson, Went, and Ranieri decided Silva had to die for it. Ott was chosen to drive Silva to the Fresno clubhouse because Silva trusted him. On July 15, 2014, Went shot Silva in the back of the head at the Fresno clubhouse. What happened next revealed something about how the Sonoma County chapter had been operating for years. Silva's body was taken to a nearby funeral home, being extorted by a Hells Angels member and incinerated in its crematorium furnace, which the club referred to among themselves as the pizza oven. Lee witness Joseph Hardesty, a former Richmond Hells Angel, told the FBI that Went admitted the pizza oven had been used for 5 or 6 bodies and that the other victims were bikers from rival clubs. Joel Silva was not the first. All 3 received mandatory life sentences. U.S. Attorney Ismail Ramsey described the organization as a brutal brotherhood whose deeds should shock the conscience of us all. As of April 2026, all 5 defendants in the broader Sonoma County and Salem RICO case, including Nelson, Went, and Ott, are challenging their convictions after prosecutors disclosed evidence that had not been provided to the defense before trial. An evidentiary hearing is expected. The life sentences stand for now, but the legal situation remains unresolved. Adam Lee Hall.
Those are witnesses who saw Adam Lee Hall in the days right after these murders are said to have happened, murders that the district attorney and prosecutors believe took place because those 3 people would implicate Adam Lee Hall for other crimes he committed.
Adam Lee Hall was 36 years old and the sergeant at arms of the Berkshire County Hells Angels when a Hampton Superior Court jury convicted him in 2014 of 3 counts of first-degree murder, alongside kidnapping, armed robbery, and witness intimidation charges. The judge who sentenced him said the crimes were unlike anything he had encountered in his judicial career and that Hall had preyed on the disabled. Per the Berkshire Eagle, Hall seemed to take the sentence in stride, showing little emotion throughout the entire proceeding as he was handed 3 consecutive life sentences, plus an additional 25 to 42 years. The story behind that sentence began in July 2009, when Hall became convinced that David Glasser, a man with a moderate developmental disability who made money doing odd jobs around Pittsfield, had stolen engine parts from him. If Hall had simply confronted Glasser or taken the matter to the club, the story would have ended there. But Hall did not confront him. He waited. And 2 years later, on August 28, 2011, in the middle of Tropical Storm Irene, he acted. That evening, Hall, along with co-defendants David Shalhoub and Caius Veiovis, went to the Pittsfield apartment shared by David Glasser, his roommate Edward Frampton, and their friend Robert Chadwell. All 3 men were abducted and taken to a remote location in the Berkshires, where they were killed, beheaded, and dismembered. Their remains were buried in a trench in the town of Beckett, Massachusetts, and were not discovered until 10 days later. Glasser had been scheduled to testify against Hall in a separate assault case the following month. Frampton and Chadwell were killed to eliminate witnesses. One of the most damaging witnesses at trial was Rose Dawson, a woman who had known Hall since they were young. She admitted on the stand that she did not want to be there, and that she felt afraid of Hall even as she testified with him looking on from the dock. Dawson told the court that Hall had visited her on the morning of August 28th. The same morning, prosecutors said the 3 men were killed and had asked her to buy bleach and drive a Buick. The prosecution had already told the jury in opening statements that that Buick had been used to transport 15 bags containing the victims' dismembered bodies to the burial site. Dawson testified that she and another witness named Alexandra Ellery had helped wash the car afterward, and that when they did, a brown-colored liquid came out of it.
She said Hall asked her to buy bleach and drive a Buick. In opening statements, the district attorney said that Buick was used to carry 15 bags of the victims' dismembered bodies to burial.
But it was what Dawson described happening at the Hells Angels clubhouse in the days after the killings that produced one of the most disturbing details of the entire trial. She testified that Hall and others accused of the murders were at the clubhouse yelling, help me," mocking the victims, laughing, pretending to run, and saying you should have seen the look on his face. The defense attempted to undermine Dawson's credibility by raising questions about her past drug use and the reliability of her recollections. Hall's attorney also argued during the proceedings that his client should have access to the law library where he was being held, so he could keep up with the case and should be allowed a haircut and a shave to appear presentable before the jury. Those were the arguments available to the defense. They were not enough. The jury convicted. 3 consecutive life sentences plus decades more. Hall showed nothing as the sentence was delivered. No remorse. He absorbed it the way a man absorbs something he has already made his peace with. Caius Veiovis.
Yeah, I'll see you all in hell, Louis, remember that. Every one of you, I'll see you in hell.
He was born Roy Gutfinski. In 2008, while serving time in Maine State Prison, he legally changed his name to Caius Domitius Veiovis, citing the Roman emperors Caligula and Nero and an ancient Etruscan demon as his inspiration. He had surgically implanted horns on his forehead, sharpened teeth, a split tongue, a 666 tattoo. His prior criminal record included a 1999 bloodletting assault in which his 16-year-old girlfriend slashed a teenage girl's back with a razor, and Veiovis licked the blood from the wound. He ultimately served more than 7 years in Maine after multiple probation violations connected to that case. By the time he was arrested in connection with the August 2011 Berkshire murders, he was 34 years old and an associate of Adam Lee Hall in the Berkshire County Hells Angels. The prosecution placed him at the scene of the abduction and murders of David Glasser, Edward Frampton, and Robert Chadwell, alongside Hall and David Chalou. Rose Dawson testified that when she arrived at Hall's home on the morning of August 28th, she found Veiovis dozing on a sofa in the living room. The 3 men had already been killed by that point. The jury took nearly 37 hours to reach its verdict spread across 6 days before convicting him. When the verdict came, it was unambiguous. 3 counts of first-degree murder, 3 counts of kidnapping, 3 counts of witness intimidation. Judge C. Jeffrey Kender sentenced him to 3 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole on September 29, 2014. At sentencing, Veiovis maintained his innocence. "Let me make this clear," he told the court. "My hand was not in this." But when the jury filed out of the courtroom after delivering their verdict, Veiovis growled loudly from the dock and shouted at the departing jurors. "I will see you in hell," he said. "Every single one of you." The Massachusetts Supreme Judicial Court later denied his appeal. The man who had legally renamed himself after emperors known for their cruelty and a demon from ancient mythology will spend the remainder of his life in a Massachusetts prison. His appeal was denied. His outburst is on the record, and the jurors he promised to see in hell are living their lives outside the walls he will never leave. Zane Peoria Wallace. When Zane Peoria Wallace was led from the courtroom of the High Court at Wanganui in September 2022, after being sentenced to life in prison with a minimum non-parole period of 15.5 years, the moment that followed was unlike anything else in this video. A member of the Wilson family shouted at Wallace as he was taken away, "I hope you burn in hell," and then the courtroom erupted. The 2 families began moving toward each other. Police and court security intervened immediately, forcing themselves between the groups and separating them before the confrontation became physical. The courtroom was eventually cleared entirely. But to understand why that courtroom reached that point, you have to understand what Jasmine Tamara Wilson endured in the 9 months before she died. Wallace and Wilson had known each other briefly as teenagers. When they reconnected in the final 9 months of her life, what followed was not a relationship in any recognizable sense. It was 9 months of escalating threats and violence that the prosecution described at trial as a sustained campaign that ended only when Wallace delivered the last fatal beating. During the period when Wallace was in prison, his phone calls to Wilson were recorded, and those recordings captured him telling her over and over again what he intended to do to her. He described beating her head in, slitting her throat, kicking her head in, splattering her brains on the pavement. Friends and family saw Wilson's injuries throughout those months. She documented some of the violence in her diary. She withstood it until she could not. Wallace wanted to join the Hells Angels, and one of the assaults on Wilson took place at the club's headquarters in Wanganui, where he was told to stop. But the assaults continued outside those walls without intervention. On the morning of July 31st, 2019, Wallace gave Wilson the final beating. He struck her in the face, opening cuts and causing bleeding in her mouth. He struck her chest and arms and broke her ribs. When his rage ran its course and she was covered in injuries with her consciousness starting to drop, he did nothing for her. Wallace's father, Stephen, arrived at the house that morning on a routine visit and saw Wilson's condition. He put her in his car and drove toward the hospital. But instead of taking her inside immediately, he waited outside for his ex-wife and daughter to arrive in separate vehicles. His daughter then drove the car to the emergency department. By the time Wilson arrived at Wanganui Hospital's emergency room, she was unconscious and severely injured. She died from her injuries on August 2nd, 2019. Wallace's father and daughter had already pleaded guilty to offenses relating to the way Wilson was transported to hospital. His mother, Leanne Wallace, was separately charged with attempting to pervert the course of justice. After Wilson's death, police planted a listening device in the house where Wallace was living with another woman. The device recorded them fighting and a late-night assault on her as well, confirming that the violence had not ended with Wilson's death. Wallace pleaded guilty on July 25, 2022. Justice Francis Cook sentenced him to life imprisonment with a minimum of 15.5 years before he could be considered for parole. Kadir P. On October 1st, 2019, the Berlin Regional Court handed down life sentences to 8 members of the Hells Angels Motorcycle Club for the 2014 execution-style murder of a rival at a betting shop in the German capital. At the center of the case was the leader of the Berlin Hells Angels chapter, known only as Kadir P. His full surname is withheld under German privacy law. He was 35 years old at sentencing, and Judge Thomas Gross described him as antisocial and aggressive. He was convicted not of pulling the trigger himself, but of incitement to murder, which under German law carries the same mandatory sentence as the killing itself, life in prison. The murder had taken place in 2014 when members of the Berlin Hells Angels chapter walked into a betting and bookmaking shop and shot a rival 6 times in an execution-style killing. The attack was described by the court as a calculated revenge murder connected to the ongoing territorial dispute between the Hells Angels and rival organizations operating in the Berlin area. 7 other members of the chapter received life sentences for their direct roles in the killing. An 8th attacker who cooperated with investigators received 12 years. A 9th man present was acquitted of involvement in the murder itself, but convicted of firearms offenses. The Berlin case was significant beyond the sentences themselves because it represented one of the most comprehensive prosecutions of a Hells Angels chapter leadership structure in German criminal history. If the Berlin Hells Angels had operated with the assumption that their organizational structure would protect individual members from accountability for collective decisions, the verdict delivered by the Berlin Regional Court answered that assumption directly and permanently. 8 men received life sentences. The chapter leader received the same sentence as the men who carried out the killing because under German law, the man who gives the order and the man who pulls the trigger occupy the same position in the eyes of the court. Kadir P. has spent every day since October 2019 inside a German prison finding out what that position actually costs. Maurice Boucher. Maurice Boucher was the president of the Quebec Nomads Hells Angels chapter, and from the early 1990s ran the most sustained outbreak of organized criminal violence in Canadian history. The Quebec biker war between the Hells Angels and the rival Rock Machine ran from 1994 to 2002 and produced approximately 160 deaths across the province. In 1997, Boucher ordered the murders of 2 Quebec prison guards, Diane Lavigne and Pierre Rondeau. They were not targeted for anything they had done. They were chosen at random from the correction system because Boucher calculated that murdering prison guards would make everyone connected to the processing of criminal cases in Quebec afraid. He was acquitted at his first trial in 1998, in a verdict later revealed to have been tainted by juror intimidation. The acquittal was overturned on appeal in 2000. At his retrial in May 2002, hitman Stéphane Gagné, who had carried out both murders, testified against him in detail. The jury convicted him with 3 life sentences. Boucher was sent to Sainte-Anne-des-Plaines, Canada's only supermax prison, and housed in a dedicated protective unit because rival organizations had already attempted to have him killed inside. But the convictions did not end his reach. In 2015, while still incarcerated, he conspired to murder underworld figure Reynald Desjardins. He pleaded guilty, and in 2018, another 10 years were added to his sentence. The Hells Angels had expelled him in 2014. His son Francis and daughter Alexandra were both subsequently connected to organized crime in their own right. On July 10, 2022, Boucher died at age 69 in the palliative care ward of Archambault Institution. He had been transferred there under secrecy weeks earlier after throat cancer metastasized beyond treatment. He had spent 20 years inside after his 2002 conviction and had never once been released on parole. He died in a prison medical ward. Life sentences, decades behind bars. A man who died in a prison medical ward after 20 years without parole. The 1% world produces men who believe the code they live by will protect them from everything, including a courtroom. But nowhere did that belief fail more completely than on the night of April 7, 2006, when a national president gave an order from Texas and 8 men drove to a farm in Ontario they would never leave. Click the next video to find out what happened.